73 countries, and we're particularly grateful to CONEVAL for allowing us to be here in this amazing brand new facilities. This year's summer school is going to benefit from excellent infrastructure, and it's going to be an amazing experience to the benefit of all of us. This wouldn't have been possible without the exceptional commitment from everybody at CONEVAL, led and coordinated by Dr. Alida Gutierrez.
The next 2 weeks will be quite intense, but as academic coordinators, we can promise you that by end of the next 2 weeks, you will find that this was highly rewarding experience. For Ophi, this summer school is an annual event, but we firmly believe that each summer school is special on its own. Now, there are several reasons for this, and I think one of the overarching reasons is that because this is a space where it brings together many people, many of us who's, with diverse academic background, professional background, with a single motivation, which is to understand and measure multidimensional poverty. Now, the other potential reason why each of the summer school is special by its own is perhaps because of these the multiple human interaction, this beautiful interaction that will be fostered through these 2 weeks. And more importantly, this interaction will go beyond the summer school, because you not only will carry the friendship, but also along with it, the knowledge from each of you and how much you could push forward the terrain of poverty measurement.
It is a true honor to start this summer school by bringing together two individuals that have been fundamental pillars when it comes to measuring and understanding multidimensional poverty all over the world, through a method that is both academically sound and also practical enough to be useful for policy purposes. Professor James Foster needs no introduction. His recognition as an academic leader in the field of poverty measurement is well known by us and by everybody in the world. Interestingly enough, his academic career is tightly linked to Mexico as well. So it is only apt for us to invite Professor James Foster to start this opening session.
Really? Yeah, I can go over there. I'll bring my computer. That's the way I do things. So. And it moves. Well, hi. How are you? Welcome, students. It's great to have you here. Good morning, colleagues. So good to meet you. Well, this is the 2019 Ophi Summer School. Remember, the summer school since 2008 has been held in venues all over the world, including, of course, Oxford and my own home institution, George Washington University in DC. But there is no more appropriate location for it to be held than here in Mexico at CONEVAL, which is the institutional embodiment of the aims and best practices that we will be covering. Not loud enough? That we will be covering during this summer course. Our lessons and lectures will draw from many sources, but eventually trace back to two interesting papers. First, a paper entitled A Class of Decomposable Poverty Measures, written with Joel Greer and Eric Thorbeck, which introduced the so-called Foster-Greer-Thorbeck, or FGT, measures in 1984. 1984, how many of you were alive in 1984? I was a just tenured professor at that point. The second paper, entitled Counting in Multidimensional Poverty Measurement, was written with Sabina Alkire and introduced the Alkire-Foster, or AF, multidimensional methodology in 2011. Now, it's clear to anyone who can use Google Scholar that both have had some success in academic circles, since our peers felt compelled to refer to the FGT paper some 6,500 times, while the citation count for the AF paper in terms of Google is 2,500. What may not be so apparent online is the huge impact that both papers have had on policy. and just how intertwined this impact has been with Mexico. So let me provide you with a little bit of historical insight, starting with the FGT paper and then moving on into multidimensional poverty. When we get into the discussion of multidimensional poverty, then my colleague will carry it forward. I'm going back a long time here. I was a PhD student working in mathematical economics at Cornell University under theorist Mukul Majumdar. He was my advisor. And in my second year, he invited a man named Amartya Sen to Cornell as a visiting scholar. I was his guide around campus, and during that time, Professor Sen encouraged me to apply my mathematical skills to poverty measurement. And I later joined with another graduate student and his professor, my two co-authors, to write the short but clear FGT paper. Has anyone read that paper here? It's a small paper, a few pages. Okay. But like most papers in economic theory, I expected it to be read by who? A handful of academics like me. I guess I was wrong. Imagine my surprise in the late 1990s when I was informed by another Cornell student, a later student, named Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, that Mexico was using the FGT measure to target the poor through its revolutionary Pobreza program. I was invited to the finance ministry here in Mexico City, where I heard the story directly from the Undersecretary of Finance, a man named Santiago Levy, who's been in Washington with us for quite a while, of how this took place. In 1991, while he was a professor himself, he'd written a paper that drew upon the properties of the FGT measure to show that the really poor people in Mexico could be found in the rural areas, and also showed how the decomposable FGT measure could be used to target resources to these poor areas and their people. Essentially, it showed how one might use data and measurement to drive policy and resources. He was later asked by the then President of Mexico to shepherd such a program, hence Pobreza. Later, by the way, CEDESOL, the Ministry of Social Development, which institutionalized the evaluation of Pobreza, pointed the way to the evaluation revolution in development economics, which now is being done via randomized control experiments, or RCTs. But it really comes back to what was happening in CEDESOL at that time. In the early 2000s, I was invited to attend an interesting policy exercise in Mexico to construct the monetary poverty methods here. And during that discussion, the FGT measures figured prominently, since by then the World Bank was using them quite exclusively for all of its poverty studies. Many of the defining principles, and this is a point for you students, you'll see it again in the lectures, what we call desiderata for poverty measurement, emerged from that consultation. As noted in a book by Miguel Secoli, who was Undersecretary at CEDESOL and later became Undersecretary at the Education Department here in Mexico. Once again, I had come to Mexico and received an education on how policy is done right. In the mid-2000s, something happened. A new law was passed here in Mexico, requiring poverty to be measured multidimensionally. I was asked by Gonzalo Hernandez to be one of the 5 teams that would propose how this might be done. If he had asked me a year before, I would have turned him down flat, since at that time I believed that poverty could not be measured multidimensionally. Even though my 1997 book with Amartya Sen, its last chapter, had actually laid the groundwork for this based on the capability approach. Fortunately, I had just met Sabina Alkire. And in 2006, she convinced me that poverty could be measured multidimensionally. We described and refined these measures, these methods, over several meetings in Mexico. And in 2009, Mexico's MPI was released. Now in 2019, there are 10 years of continuous and consistent, very consistent data on multidimensional poverty in Mexico. So you see from the beginning, we have listened and learned from Mexico and from the 50 or so other countries that have followed Mexico in showing how poverty might be measured multidimensionally, using their own implementations of the MPI, reflecting their own national priorities. So let me stop at that point. I want my co-author to talk about multidimensional poverty in a more expansive way. Would you do so, Sabina?
I'll try.
Would you like for me to continue? I could continue.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So let me tell you. The key benefit of multidimensional poverty is that through this process, and as done in best practices here at CONEVAL, it is intentional measurement. It doesn't just happen along and you use, something you pick out of the ground. It is through thinking deeply about what is important to the people that then becomes represented through the methodology in a clear way with a headline figure and the dimensions which are important. Each one of those you can build all the way down through the measure to see what is going on. And more than that, remember the decomposability I mentioned to you a second ago? It has that across regions. So you can look at every state and see how poverty, multidimensional poverty, differs across states. This is extremely powerful. So what this means is that if you suffer a jolt, I think we all suffered a jolt in 2007, 2008. Everyone here in this room? Financial disaster. So what happened to poverty in Mexico? It went up. Now, if we didn't have multidimensional poverty, what would have happened? Poverty goes up. That's all we would know. But with multidimensional poverty, we see, it's the income dimension. The income dimension that's so closely linked to the neighbor in the north. The good policies that the government might be undertaking in the social dimensions continued apace. And you could see the results across time through that, you see? So that meant that the government's good policies were maintained and reinforced with the good outcomes, while they could also focus on trying to deal with this very thorny question of how do you help the incomes of people who are poor during a recession. So it leads to a feedback process that encourages good governance, because the government is doing the right thing, and you have a jolt, and it still can do the right thing rather than having to backpedal and say, oh, poverty, we've messed up, poverty's going up. No, you can explain the texture of poverty to people. And this is in fact what happened here in Mexico. The second very interesting aspect of this, we didn't understand at all until we got the examples of Mexico, Colombia, and other countries, whereby the entire development program of a country was mapped to the dimensions of the measure. Now, what does that do? That allows a kind of leadership through measurement, whereby it's a lateral leadership, where the ministers, each one responsible for their own dimensions, come and sit at the table. And the president says, how have you done? And they say, well, I've been able to do this progress since the last time we met. Oh, that's not very much. Accountability, leadership, a shared purpose through the overall measure, but individual responsibility and accountability through the dimensions. So that second approach of this coordination of effort was seen in that example, but it even goes further. You coordinate the effort through the people who hear about the measure. They can see the measure since it's transparent, right? And so this collaboration becomes much broader than most of the time when you have an economist, let's say, just for the heck of it, from the World Bank, saying, here's the definition of poverty, here's how it should be, here's the number, and no one knows where it came from. Okay? So that's the second very important aspect. The final is this, that many countries do the first part and the second part, but very few countries do the third part, which is institutionalize these other two. Institutionalize. And we are in the building where the embodiment, as I said before, of all that we'll be studying today and tomorrow and the next weeks is placed in Mexico. This is where it happens. That's an extremely important part of the issue, because if you can then, 10 years after starting, creating a new measure, come to it and say, all right, how have things changed? Here's the new measure, and roll it out, do a parallel of the two measures for a while, for transparency's sake, but continue the good work with the ebb and flows of politics, the ebb and flows of other things, right? Of actual conditions on the ground. Then that will lead to more possibilities of great results in helping the poor. That's my comment. Thank you.
So thanks, James. So quite unusually, James may have appeared a bit taller, but that's because the work that he does, but also because he was standing on this platform that was probably meant for someone short like me.
I'm so sorry.
But
I stood on the floor. But
like James, Professor Sabina needs no introduction. But I have to say this, that her passion and commitment in delivering powerful tools to combat poverty is something that has inspired many of us here. And under her leadership, she has also established many platforms that bring all of us together to discuss poverty, as well as to have this knowledge exchange. And one of those platforms is a summer school as such as this. The first summer school that Ophi hosted was in 2008 in Delhi. And more than 10 years has passed since, and we are all here today. So without further ado, I would like to call Sabina to share a couple of words on the summer school itself. Thank you.
Should I be on the step?
yes.
Okay. No, first of all, a warm welcome to all of you, and an equally warm and heartfelt thank you to our friends and hosts in CONEVAL. It's a delight to be here 10 years after Mexico became the first government to launch an official multidimensional poverty measure, and to have had them release their updated 10-year figures so recently. It's very, very meaningful, and I hope that we will learn a lot more as we are here. So in terms of the summer school that we are initiating here, we deliberately have focused on two different groups of people, the academic and the practical. And it's very much like Ophi, our team, which is a research center in the University of Oxford. We all do academic research and publish it. But why do you do research on poverty? Why do you work on the tools of poverty? You do it not just to publish papers, you do it to try to be useful to end poverty. And so all of us then all have another role, another part of our activities, which is the practical. And so sometimes in the summer school, you will also see more academic focused or more policy focused sessions. But we very much want to bring the two audiences together. One, because we need one another. A policymaker has to make a decision very quickly. Somebody who can analyze, do policy analysis of the drivers, the determinants, the evaluations of programs, can bring 3 years of research to a policymaker who must decide in a week. And so we both need to be focused on these problems of poverty with complementary tools so that when we need one another, we have that kind of support. And in terms of the practical side, if you just think of, since this time in 2018, there were a lot of countries who launched their new official MPI. Afghanistan, Andhra Pradesh, a state in India, Nepal, Nigeria, Malaysia. Panama launched a child MPI. Philippines, a trial. Rwanda, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, the most recent country to launch, in Vietnam. And so many of you are coming from places where your country will be on that list next year, where you are coming towards finalization of the MPI, or maybe just starting the process. And so welcome to the summer school. Our aim for you is to give you the tools you need, both to do the computations, but also to talk with your superiors and to talk with people in policy, so that you can, in a sense, articulate both the technical and the policy aspects of this work. And to those of you who are studying or in academia, our aim is really to support you in the papers, that the papers that work on MPI be of the highest rigor, be very well informed, but also be pioneering. We're building a new field. We need new James Fosters who will, as part of their doctorate or as part of their first professorship, do the pioneering work in this area. So welcome to both. So what are we doing? And apologies that the slide is so small, but sometimes it's useful to see where you're going before you get stuck into the 67th PowerPoint slide of a lecture. So we begin today with a lecture from Professor John Scott, sharing the experience here in Mexico. We begin with a case study that had both academic and practical import. And really, because that's the goal that we're aiming towards. And then a first question that you will be asked when you return to your country and give your seminar to your colleagues is, why do we need a multidimensional poverty measure? Isn't income enough? Isn't the SDG dashboard enough? So we need to see, how does an MPI fit into the SDG framework? What does it add that income maybe doesn't see so clearly? How much does it cost? And so that's what the first lecture is about, both in terms of a normative or a value framework, but also in terms of an empirical framework. And you, like I, might be surprised, because we would assume that they were correlated or associated, monetary and multidimensional poverty, in ways that when we go down to the microdata, we don't always find. Next, we'll want to move towards measurement, but we start with unidimensional, because some people come from different disciplines, and not everybody studied FGT yesterday. So James will take us through the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke class of measures, but he will also introduce to us properties. I never studied axioms when I studied, and they sounded quite scary. And so James will basically explain to us what is an axiom or a property of a measure, and why are they important? Why is his work important in what we do for policy, so that you don't get surprises when you're in the field and releasing measures. And then we'll look at the broader community. We are going to be focusing from day 2 onwards on a particular methodology, but we need to know our neighbors. And so we need to look at the unmet basic needs tradition in Latin America, the counting tradition in Europe. We need to know fuzzy set and PCA, principal components analysis, and other ways of building measures. And so that's what we'll look at in the afternoon today to contextualize. Now, think of yourself. You've just traveled, you're jet lagged, English is probably not your first language, and then we hit you with 6 hours of lectures. I'm so sorry. It will get better. Today is the worst, tomorrow is the next worst, and then it starts to become fun. Okay? Day 2, you begin with Chris, and Chris is a joy, and Chris will entertain you with AF Light. James, of course, will give you the AF method proper, like you can teach it to others, but Chris will give you 4 or 5 slides you can show to your president, you can show to your minister, that she can understand. So how do you communicate this, not in a matrix, but to people who can understand? And then we'll have a moment to think about the more value-oriented part of life. capability approach, Ubuntu, liberation theology, human rights approach, unmet basic needs. There are many conceptual approaches that recognize the multidimensionality of poverty. And we need to think of those and then also think of the participatory voices of the poor, bottom-up grassroots exercises that listen to the protagonists of poverty, which are the men and women in communities who live in poverty. And how do we unleash their imagination? We might be experts, we might do poverty measures and policies, but without the action of the poor people themselves, it's not going to work. So we need a session on that. And then we move to the global MPI, so you see some of this in action. You'll see some results, you'll see some measures, you'll see what James talked about decomposition and breakdown in a concrete example. And you'll also get some homework. A society of 4 people and 4 dimensions, and you'll do your own AF measure tomorrow night. Yeah. And then we have this session, which is your least favorite of the entire summer school. So apologize in advance, I teach it, so apologies in advance. None of us, well, I don't know, some of you may have gotten your doctorate in philosophy, but none of us feel equipped to make value judgments. We tend to come from social sciences, we tend to come from disciplines where we can analyze and study and give evidence. But a poverty measure is also an art, which has to embody the values of the poor people and in compromise with the values of the policymakers and the national plans. And in making an MPI, there are different value judgments that perhaps we should not shy away from. And so we'll talk about how to make those, and then at the same time, how to bring in rigorous techniques to test them. But we have to think about the normative, the moral, the ethical aspects, because you can't measure poverty without those, even in income space. Okay, now it gets easier. Day 3, you go through your homework and see if you did it right. And then you start to think about data and indicators and what might be the considerations. What's a good indicator for an MPI? It can't be a time use with a 24-hour recall period. It can't be a measure that only is good for people who are 99 years of age, if you're doing a national MPI. So you'll think a little bit about data and indicators. And then you'll start to see some examples of national MPIs other than the CONEVAL, which we've already seen in action. So you'll see Colombia, you'll see Bhutan, you'll see Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, different MPIs. So you get an idea of their structure. And you'll have a take-home exam before you get into a specific data set to think about these concepts and to see if where you are with us up to this point, other than being sleep-deprived and bored. And then we break into working groups. And I think that's what you will remember most about the summer school, is all the time in working groups, the discussions, the fights, the triumphs, the presentations. So you'll be in the same working groups the rest of the time. So on Thursday, you'll begin in Stata, reviewing some concepts and opening the data set. And then creating a deprivation matrix of 0 and 1 deprivations for your chosen indicators, and each of you will choose some indicators. And then you'll ask, well, isn't it the same that if a child is out of school and no adult in the household has completed 6 years of schooling, 8 years of schooling, wouldn't they be the same households? So you'll learn how to test redundancy and see if the association between 2 indicators is really tight, in which case if you use both, there might be questions as the value added of each indicator. And then you'll also learn about interpreting those, when it might be sensible to use both anyway, because they don't move together over time. And then we start to focus more on the measurement, but on Saturday, you'll do a first presentation from 11:30 on, and the presentations will be from the working groups of your proposed measure for your country. And these are a chance for you to practice communicating and also to step in and see where you are before we get into the more quantitative parts. Then you'll make an MPI. Monday morning of next week, you'll have your country's MPI. Then by Monday afternoon, you'll know how to decompose it, how to do maps in Stata, how to do a breakdown by indicator. And so you can show the policymakers, okay, this is your poverty, this is where it is in the country, this is how it is by indicator. And then, of course, everybody asks about the weights. Even in CONEVAL, I remember so many discussions on the weights. So what we do is we use lots, and we do tests of robustness to see how sensitive your policy prescriptions are to changes in the weights, changes in the poverty cutoff, even changes in the indicators. You'll learn to do that Monday night. Monday's a tough day. But then next, you are going to be like CONEVAL. You have to do 10 years over time. So thus far, we've looked at one period in time. Tuesday next week, you look at changes over time and practice those. And Tuesday night, we have a special session on the global MPI outside of CONEVAL for those of you who wish. And then we have academic and policy options 3 mornings in a row, and you can choose which one you'll go to. Both will be taught. So regression or communicating. Personally, I really advise communicating if you are at all in policy, because we are not used to communicating on social media, on all of the press interviews that CONEVAL have had to take. And so practicing that and learning some tips can be very useful. Impact evaluation or child MPI. Those are some different options. On Thursday, you'll have a special lecture from Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, also who is involved in the CONEVAL process, who's been at UNDP and at the World Bank, situating all that you've learned in summer school from a policy perspective. And then on Friday, you'll have all day where your working groups will present your new MPI for a country. By then, you'll have gone through all of these steps, and we'll see all of them put together in presentations. Presentations you can refer to, presentations you can show back. Of course, they won't be perfect. So the Ophi team will try to give some comments and some suggestions so that you can improve. But the aim of this course is very much to improve so that you become, you know, the voice boxes, the creators and the innovators of this work. So that's the summer school. I'd just like to end by introducing you to a South-South network, because it was really launched, the idea came very much from CONEVAL and Ophi. Because in 2009, they launched their MPI. By 2012, Ricardo, others were so inundated by requests from other countries, it was tiring. So we said, let's get them to talk to each other. We launched with President Santos from Mexico, from Colombia, and Amartya Sen in Oxford. And Oxford is an unlikely place to launch a poverty network, but 16 countries were present in person. By the next year in Germany, it was 32. Then in Colombia, it was 40. In Acapulco, in Mexico, it was 51. It is a very memorable meeting for many reasons. Some happy and some challenging, because it was election day in the US. Then we went to Beijing and Johannesburg in South Africa, and this year it was in the Seychelles. Next year it will be in Chile, so back in Latin America. So this is a South-South network trying to learn both technical and policy lessons one from another. So we have Statistical Commission events and UN General Assembly events. Last year it was hosted by the President of Panama with other high-level representatives. This year, it is hosted by the President of Costa Rica, and it will be a very high-level panel because of the nature of the UN General Assembly this year. We also have the Statistics Commission events with heads of statistical offices from many countries. So when you go back, we will ask you to also inform your colleagues about these events so they might come in. And this handbook, which Monica Pinilla, who is arriving today or tomorrow, she's in El Salvador today meeting the president of the country about their MPI, and Corinne, Adriana, Anavaj have worked on. This will also be a text which is online, which you can use for the first time. It was just launched in July. You're the first summer school to be able to use it. The reason we launched it is that our book was very good for putting people to sleep, but it wasn't so good for practical use. So the handbook is a little more practical. We have a magazine, Dimensiones. We also have a set of policy briefings. And interestingly, as James said, one of the policy briefings is focused on CONEVAL because it's profiling for the other countries the importance of the institutionality of CONEVAL, of having an autonomous group that's focused on evaluation and metrics. And there's so much interest in other countries because usually their statistical offices does the data collection, but they're not so used to measurement. So there's a lot of interest, and the policy briefing focuses on that, or on coordination, or on participatory work and listening to poor people in communities. So that's our work. As Usha said, we also love our work, and I hope that the relationships that we have and build up here will be enjoyable and not just long. And I must say that many of the Ophi team are here, many others are not here, but we are all looking forward to this, committed to working together now and working together in the future after the course. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Sabina, for showing us what is the structure and the nature of the summer school. I guess that now everybody understands the importance of bringing together both academics and practitioners and policymakers. And I guess that it is apparent from the structure that we have to the summer school that it is going to be interactive and it is going to be cordial and friendly all along. So we are very pleased to be hosted by an institution that we already mentioned is a worldwide pioneer in measuring multidimensional poverty all around the world. So to officially start this year's summer school, so I please ask you to join me in welcoming the Executive Secretary of CONEVAL, Dr. José Nabor Cruz Marcelo.
It's more comfortable. Okay. Good morning. Okay. It's a pleasure to be able to meet you all. I am José Nabor Cruz Marcelo, the Executive Secretary of the National Council of the Evaluation for the Social Development Policy, CONEVAL. We're very glad to have you here for attendance of the 2019 Office Summer School. We will very much like to thank Sabina Alkire and John Foster for pushing this event forward, as well as the rest of the office staff, Adriana, Freya, Chris, Osha, Corinne, Davina, Hector, Moni, Fanny, and Ricardo. Also, thanks to all the attendants to this year's summer school. You can be proud to be among the select privileged people that are going to drive the research, actions, and policy that will help broaden to the understanding of multidimensional poverty and helping its elevation back in your country. CONEVAL has a long history of collaboration with Dr. Sabina and James. When Mexico decided there was going to be an official multidimensional poverty index, various experts on the field were invited to the discussion. Therefore, back in 2007, they were part of the group of experts that gave their proposal on different methodologies for multidimensional poverty measurement. There were 5 distinct views, all of them very valuable on their own right. At the end, CONEVAL Academic Board agreed on the Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI, we have been using for the past 10 years. This methodology consists of 2 broad analytic spaces. On one hand, economic well-being, measured through per capita household income. On the other, social rights deprivation, all of which are universal human rights warranted by our political constitution. This means that you can think on the Mexican MPI in terms of 2 axes, one of which is economic well-being, while the other involves social deprivation. In 2004, before the gathering of experts we have just talked about, the Mexican Congress approved the General Law of Social Development. The law is the origin of CONEVAL, as it mandated its creation, and it also pointed to the main characteristics of the multidimensional poverty measurement that must be carried on in the country. Specifically, this law not only obliged the newly created CONEVAL to measure poverty and evaluate social programs, but it also enumerates of social rights and which will be included in the poverty index. Mexico was the first country to incorporate an official multidimensional poverty measurement. The general law of social development provided not only the foundation for a state measurement of poverty, but also its main guidelines, dimensions, periodicity, and territorial disaggregation. It also means an upgrade from early conceptualization and definition of poverty. Furthermore, it also provided a solid ground for the adaptation of the multidimensional poverty approach in Mexico. Once the Mexican state recognized that it's not only how much you earn, but how is the population living up or not their rights, public policies changed dramatically. Each deprivation is directly linked to a governmental sector involved in its fulfillment. It also serves as an evaluation of how well the state is achieving the tasks imposed on it by law, providing health care, clean water, education, appropriate housing, and food. All become governmental priorities to be addressed by specific measures of public programs aimed at reducing the harsh condition of those with any level of deprivation. CONEVAL is not only in charge of the official poverty measurement, it also evaluates all social development programs at the national, state, and municipality level. This means that public spending is subject to being given a score of how good its performance is, starting from the design of the program, to application, processes, and finally to evaluate results and impact details. CONEVAL institutional designs ensure the accomplishment of the task. CONEVAL evaluates with academic rigor and independence from ministers and programs. Another figure that makes CONEVAL stand out from other technical entities in the Mexican government is its academic work. Our 6 academic research address the most important strategy and methodological issues. All of them have a successful academic career. They are acknowledged investigators from prestigious Mexican universities. They all continue to be a part of their respected research centers. This means they are independent in their respected fields of work, and which helps ensure the technical rigor and robustness of the decision taken. This is just a big picture. My colleague, one of the 6 academic research, John Scott, will further explain the development of Mexican official multidimensional measurement of poverty. Once again, welcome to Mexico, welcome to CONEVAL. I hope you all enjoyed your stay with us. Thank you.
I need this. So thank you, Dr. Cruz. Thank you so much for your hospitality and your time. So with this, this is the start of the summer school. So we've come to an end of the first part of the opening session. The second part will be led by a formal opening lecture by Dr. John Scott. Would you like to, should we start now, or?
You ready?
Yeah. Okay. So there's going to be a bit of logistics rearrangement. We probably would invite all of us on the podium to sort of come to the front seat, if possible.
Or back seats, it's okay. We're okay.
I just need them to put my presentation. Welcome to Mexico, and welcome to CONEVAL in particular. Let me start while my presentation is put on. As has been already mentioned, here, I'm going to try to cover first to tell you a bit about the institutional design and legal mandate of CONEVAL, which I think CONEVAL in Mexico's experience could be of interest as a case study of how to set up not only a measure of poverty, of multidimensional poverty, and not only to see how it works. We have had 10 years of experience now, but also how to actually set up an institution which makes that measure credible, stable over time, technically credible, autonomous from government institutions, which are evaluated. Mexico's case might be a bit special because of the way, because of Mexico's political history. The measure, to have an autonomous institution separated from the people who actually implement public policy was very important. But I'm sure there are many countries in the same or similar situation. Then I will talk a bit about the measurement, the measure, how it came about, what the foundations are, the normative foundations, these things that Sabina mentioned, the morality behind it, the methodology, the technical methodology, and then something which is extremely important, which is generally not covered because it's more difficult to write a handbook about that, which is how it's actually used to inform public policy, to evaluate public policy. And finally, I'm going to tell you a bit about, we just presented last week our latest results, which allowed us to present a whole decade, complete decade of poverty measurements. And I'm going to talk a bit about what's next, which also might be of interest. Poverty, this might be controversial to say in a class, in a seminar on poverty measurement, but poverty measurement is extremely basic and crude, no, as a public policy guidance. No, it is constrained, as you know, by the statistical information you have available. In the case of Mexico, by law, by mandate, we have to measure not only at the national and state level, but also at the municipality level. That means that for that we have to use a census, and as you can imagine, you cannot use the census to ask subjective well-being or infant mortality or a lot of very interesting security, a lot of very interesting questions which are not covered. So in the future, we're looking to go beyond poverty measurement in the sense that we want to have not only the basic access, for example, to social rights that I will explain you in a moment, but also effective access, whether you can actually, what's the quality of the services, and also to not to be constrained by the information, to construct a system of information which uses a lot of sources. As you know, and you will learn very, very quickly, to have a multidimensional poverty measure, you have to use just one data source because you want to see what's most interesting about that. It's not that you have a lot of people with lacking education and lacking health and lacking income. You want to see that the same family has a problem in all the dimensions, or in some of the dimensions, or in none of the dimensions. Okay, so let me be very quickly about the history of CONEVAL and the context in which it emerged. Mexico in 2000 had no poverty, no official poverty measure. There was an initiative from the government to set up an income poverty measure. And then there was a demand from opposition parties to make that income measure institutionalized and to go beyond our income measure. A law was passed by all parties unanimously, which is the social development law. And that law actually did a lot of the work that then CONEVAL implemented. It mandated the combination of income and 6 or more social rights. The framework was was a mixed framework. Really the center is social rights. And then combined with income, that's one thing which is different from the MPI methodologies that many countries use, that we combine income and social non-monetary measures in the same category. We don't have two, an income and a non-income measures. We have just one, and that we think is very useful because it allows you to see not only who are deprived in many dimensions, but who are deprived in many non-monetary dimensions, and also lack resources to buy things in the markets. I'm not entirely sure why that's not the most popular way of combining, but I'm sure you will discuss it in the seminar. Then CONEVAL was created in 2006, and our first measure came out in 2009, and we just, as I mentioned last week, published 10 years of that. As I mentioned, this is based on human rights as established in the Mexican political constitution. That's our normative basis, not only of the dimensions, but also of the thresholds. We use what the constitution mandates as the minimum level which should be reached, for which of course changes over time. In the case of education, it was basic education when we set up this measure. Now it's how do you call it? Educación media superior, higher education, and we are updating the measure to incorporate that. CONEVAL was set up with two main functions, with three main functions really. The second very important one, in addition to measuring poverty, is evaluation, to evaluate social programs. These functions are not independent, of course. No, poverty measure can be seen as an evaluation of the whole development of the country, looking at the most urgent indicator. But then you can evaluate programs, and that's the second thing that we do. And monitoring, not evaluating, but monitoring over time how these programs are evolving through indicators. The context, very quickly, is just Mexico had a democratic transition. I don't know how many are from Mexico here. A lot, so you know. We had one-party system for many years. Towards the end of the 20th century, gradually, we had a democratic transition. And that created a movement towards increasing transparency, autonomy, division of powers. And I think it was in that context that not only CONEVAL, but some other autonomous institutions, like the electoral institutions, were created. Recently, and there was also an important initiative from the Treasury side of introducing evidence-based policy as not only as a practice, but in law. So we now in Mexico have an evidence-based evaluation system for policy, and the idea is to actually use it to decide the budget. CONEVAL produces, for example, each year a recommendation for the budgetary allocations based on the evaluations. Okay, that's easier said and normed and made law than done in practice. It's very complicated, as you know, evaluating and going from evaluations, from documents, especially from a lot of evaluations. CONEVAL has produced thousands of evaluations. Actually synthesizing all that information into a policy guide is very difficult, as it is using poverty measures as a policy guide, as we will see. It's a whole other field. No? So the mission is to evaluate and to measure poverty, to do it objectively, autonomously. CONEVAL also, let me show you how that autonomy and technical basis has been built. No? But so guarantee access to information. Everything we produce is you can go to the page and you can download it. It's not only the results, but actually in the case of poverty, for example, the program. So anybody can reproduce the poverty measure, which is very important, again, in a context where we started with a lot of suspicion, no? Whether the poverty measure was manipulated, whether it was ideological, whether it was political biased. We put everything in place to make sure that suspicion is destroyed. No? So results-based methodologies consistent with national reality, a commitment with not only with the best quality of research in CONEVAL staff, but also we try to train. We do courses like this, the evaluation across the country for state level functionaries and for federal level functionaries as well. And again, no ideology, no political biases, just evidence. That's our CONEVAL's motto, can see somewhere, yes, lo que se mide se puede mejorar. What can be measured can be made better. No? That's the idea. It can also not, no? But certainly measurement evidence is a basis. No? If then governments don't use it, that's another story, but certainly if that evidence is not created, you cannot blame anybody for not using evidence. No? So evidence is fundamental. As I said, there are many frameworks, capabilities, welfareism, primary goods that you can, in Latin America we have a long tradition of basic needs, used to sustain, to give an ethical basis to poverty measure. In the case of Mexico, human rights were fundamental, and we will see that one of the most interesting things about Mexican's measure is that how do you combine human rights with income, which comes more from a welfarist, or is more consistent with our welfarist tradition. It's not easy, no, but we will see. We did it in a very simple way, actually. Let me, before I go to that, show you the structure of CONEVAL and what gives its autonomy. CONEVAL is not formally autonomous because it's still part of the government now, but the autonomy is based on the governance. And the governance is based on, we have 6 academics. I'm one of those, which, as Dr. Cruz mentioned, we are not functionaries, public functionaries. We are here part-time, and we have no alliance, political alliance. As Sabina mentioned, our interest is in academics, but since the reason we work in these subjects is not by accident, it's not because physics, we couldn't do physics, it's because, also we couldn't do physics, but it's mainly because we are interested in solving problems, urgent problems in inequality, in a very unequal society like Mexico. No? And those 6 academics have a majority of the vote in the direction of the institution, so that makes it autonomous. Recently, well, not so recently, a few years ago, there was a constitutional reform which made CONEVAL formally autonomous outside the government, but the secondary laws to implement that have not yet passed, so we are still in a transitional period. No? So let me jump a bit of this. We have seminars, a lot of seminars, as I mentioned, for state-level employees. We also recently had published a course based on online, which I think is available already. Ricardo, the course is available already for people to look at or not? The mock course, the course online on poverty measure. Okay, that's available for you to check. As Sabina mentioned, we are part of the network, and we have been part since the beginning. CONEVAL's effort was pioneering. No, there weren't many countries or no countries doing that as an official poverty measure, so that was very important. And also, we try to have some relationship with the 2030 agenda. With there was some impact, I hope, in the fact that multidirectional poverty is included in that agenda. And in the case of Mexico, for example, we can relate that agenda to our own dimensions. No? As you know, the 2030 agenda is, I don't want to sound politically incorrect, but it's a bit ambitious, and you need to give it structure and guidance. No? And that's one of the things which these measures can do. So let me go to the way the methodology came about. James mentioned, James and Sabina were one important input. We started with expert consultations. At that time, there wasn't an Ophi we could go to and say, well, give us your handbook and we'll apply it. We had to build the methodology from scratch, so we consulted with a lot of the experts, including Jose Luis Lopez Calva, who will be here in a few days, and other very well-known experts in this. Then we commissioned 5 methodological proposals, one by James and Sabina, Julio Volvinic, Chuck Lavarty, David Gordon, Hernandez, and Soto. No? So very different methodologically, extremely different in origins, a bit like what you will see in the afternoon, I understand, where you will see completely different ways of doing it. And then from that, we actually selected, we constructed a combination. We discussed it, we evaluated the data, we generated a lot of the data, or we asked the National Statistical Institution to generate them, and finally the methodology was approved. A lot of both international and national institutions participated, so it was a very widely consulted effort. Certainly it was not an academic exercise within very narrow walls. And what we came up with was something like this, no? Which might be easier to see in the next graph I will show you, but let me first, as you see, there are income, and then 6 dimensions: access to education, access to health services, to social security, to the quality of housing, space, to services in housing, electricity, water, to food, and finally, in a challenge to actually incorporate, but very interestingly, a territorial dimension, no? Social cohesion and some kind of access to the territory. And then by law, we had to publish every 2 years using the income and expenditure survey, the poverty measure at the national and state level, and every 5 years, poverty at the municipality level. And a less well-known story about the methodology is how we resolve this, how do you go from the census, which is extremely basic, as you know, to poverty estimates for municipalities, which in Mexico are very small, and even we have done for blocks, city blocks, no, at a very fine level. And there, CONEVAL innovated in, well, again, there was a process of consultation in small area estimation techniques, which is to take a census, which is the good thing about census are that they're extremely representative. No, they are perfectly representative in principle, and you combine them with richer sources like the income survey, income and expenditure survey, which is not so representative but is richer, and you use that to impute with common characteristics and with many other sources. It's a very complex exercise. Statistical is a whole, I think it's the most complex thing by far that CONEVAL does in terms of statistical methods. But it's very important because what governments want to do is not, it's nice to know poverty at the national level and at the state level, but very often you want to go to the municipality, and even within the municipality, you want to see which localities are, you should prioritize which blocks, which parts of Mexico City should be a priority, and that you can only do with these methods. I don't know if you will see something of this here in the course, but it's very important. And again, there's nothing you can take from the shelf. No, there's no handbook in this area. No, it should be a future research question. Well, we've learned to present this in a very, I think, a useful way, which is in a two-dimensional space. No, one way to look at CONEVAL's measure is that it's a two-dimensional measure based on income on the one hand, which is in the vertical, and no, I don't have laser. Oh, yes, but and the 6 social rights on the vertical. So the definition is on the horizontal. Sorry. Sorry. You're poor if you have 2 characteristics. You are jointly, no? You are below a poverty line, which in this case is based on a food basket plus a non-food basket, and if you have at least one of these social deprivations. And you are extremely poor if you have at least 3 of the deprivations and you are below the food basket, no? So the extreme poor in Mexico, which fortunately has been going down, unlike general poverty, it's now about 7%, but that's a very tragic group because that group faces on average about 3.6 deprivations, and they cannot buy the normative basic food basket, even if they spend their whole income on that. Okay? And the poor, this is the definition: a poor person is in multiracial poverty when he has not met at least one social deprivation and her income is below the value of the basket, of the combined basket. And extremely poor when she has at least 3 deprivations and his income is below the food basket. Okay? This is extreme poverty. What's left is moderate poverty, and if you look at this, we call this these areas here vulnerable. These are people who have the income, but they lack some of the social rights, and these are people who are below the income but have all the lacks. So these are vulnerable people, and obviously the idea of policy is to go to the green area, no? Where you don't have problems, income problems, nor access to services problems. Okay. These are the numbers for the last measure that we have, which again we presented last week. We have about 50 million, more than 52 million poor persons by this definition, 9.3 extreme poor persons. And as you can see, we can see the evolution not only of extreme poverty and moderate poverty, but also of people who are vulnerable by social deprivations, vulnerable by income, and people who are non-poor and non-vulnerable. Okay. There you can barely see the poverty lines, but they are. The food poverty line is about, somebody can see it in dollars. That's a month, no? Per capita per month, okay? Well, one interesting question, I don't know if we will discuss that, but I would be interested in discussing it with James and Sabina and with whoever, because to me, I have never seen a discussion whether to include income or not, no? And I just want briefly to explain why Mexico included income in one measure. One, we had to because it was a legal mandate, no? I don't know what the congressmen saw, what their basis was to mandate that, but that was the mandate, so we had to do it. But we also think it's a very good idea. Probably many countries don't do it because they come from an income poverty and just want to complement it. In the case of Mexico, this was like an original exercise, so we thought about this from zero, rather than starting from a strong, well-established income poverty. So that's a second reason. And a very important reason is that it's easier to communicate one measure. It's very difficult for the public to understand, well, poverty according to A is this, and poverty according to B is this other thing. People think about poverty, maybe it's a thinking we want to change, but certainly people think that poverty is like kilos or meters. They think that it's a single dimension which is objectively measurable and very clear. So it's very difficult to communicate different types of poverty. And finally, more substantively, I think, certainly in a very income unequal country like Mexico, and also non-monetary dimensions unequal, it's very important to distinguish between people who don't have access to all the services but are not poor. They can access, for example, through their own means because they have money. Slim, the richest man in Mexico, for example, probably doesn't have Social Security. But that's not a problem for Slim because he can go to the market and buy a very, very good, he's self-insured, no? So we wanted to focus on the people who not only lack access to services, but are also income poor. Those are the urgent, it's a matter of intensity of the poverty. No? So I hope you have a chance to discuss that issue. I'm sure you will have. Well, the informational sources is the official statistics in Mexico, the NIC. and again, as I mentioned, the census. This, by the way, especially the census, as much as we use these sophisticated small area techniques, puts strong constraints on the richness of the poverty measure. No? You will be all tempted to say, well, let's include subjective well-being, or let's include public security, public safety, let's include the quality of services, and it will be very difficult. That's why our measure has, the basic measure is just access to services, not the results, not whether those services are of good quality or not, and just these services, the mandated services, certainly not. We would like to have a richer measure, but the constraint is the information. So what's the use? The use, I think, will be obvious when I present our results. So maybe I should really jump to the results and then come back to this. But let me just introduce quickly. It should be useful for Congress, certainly, when the Congress decides the budget, when they take those decisions. Very important to see if public policy is affecting poverty or not. And then in the evaluation side, to see what parts, the details, what is working, what is not working. Certainly, obviously, for the local governments, for the federal government, and for society in general, no? For academics. No? A lot of our users of the information are people who are interested in seeing, obviously, what are the causes of poverty, what is working, how much is economics, how much is social policy, other political constraints to the attack on poverty. No? Very interesting questions done by academics, and civil society, of course. It's a very important user. Has been useful for identifying the dimensions on which public intervention must focus. No? As you will learn, and you know, I'm sure, most of you, very clearly, the great advantage and the great motivation for this poverty, for these measures, is that income. If you tell a policymaker, contribute to do policies to increase the income of the poor, through the education ministry. That's a very indirect path, or also a health ministry. Generally, the instruments that public agencies have, governments have, to attack social well-being, to alleviate social inequalities, are education, health, social security, housing. So it's a good idea to measure those things directly rather than throwing them. No, and also. It has all the right properties in terms of that you will see that James will describe, I'm sure in great detail, the composability geographically by groups, etc., which allows you to see what is contributing to poverty and which is the optimal way, ignoring costs, which is the optimal way to bring poverty down, no? And then including costs, which is the most cost-effective policy intervention. Okay, so it's. In a very basic way, it sets up the policy agenda. Very basic because we were very lucky in Mexico, for example, that in recent administrations there was an interest to actually take the poverty measure as a direct guide to policy. So that was the main objective. No, it was introduced in the Plan Nacional de Desarrollo, which is the official national plan, no, explicitly. And we were very happy because that's our goal. But at the same time, we were afraid that governments could take that as a final point, no? And it should be the starting point. You can have access to all of the services, but if they don't work, if they don't have the right quality, if they are very far away from people's homes, then it's not much of a progress. So you need to go beyond the basic poverty measure when you do policy. No? Well, let me go directly to there are many specific applications. For example, again, as James mentioned, in many cases, Mexico has used poverty measures to target programs explicitly, And one interesting aspect, in addition to Pobreza that you mentioned, is the federalized funds, the decentralized funds that Mexico uses, which have been growing. And this is, for example, a basic social infrastructure fund, and that uses our measure directly, not only the actual level, but the change in the levels in multinational poverty, and there are funds which use this information. So again, it's very another important way it has been used. More indirectly, there has been a lot of debate recently in Mexico about minimum salary, which was extremely minimum in Mexico. It was used to tackle inflation rather than protect people from labor income poverty, and that is changing. And the yardstick to see where to put it, naturally, is the income extreme poverty line in Mexico, because constitutionally, that concept, the minimum salary concept, is defined as a salary which is enough, sufficient for a family to live, a whole family. And now it's finally, after it has been increased, it's at the per capita poverty level, extreme poverty level. So we are still far away from the whole family, but still it has been progressing thanks in part to this. And let me jump this and go directly to, this is a strategy that I mentioned that is targeting, that was targeting in the previous administration, directly to trying to focus directly on the deprivations that the poverty index identifies at the state and the municipality level. Okay, we have many publications which you can consult, which go identify in a more detailed way needs in specific groups. That's another thing which can be done with these measures. And let me, with that, give you some idea of the estimates we just said for Mexico, we just presented. As you can see, this is poverty in numbers, in millions of people. We have, it went from 49.4 million to 42.4. So not a dramatically, there's an increase in poverty, despite there being a slight decrease in the incidence of poverty. These are percentages. That's the orange rectangle we saw before, and this is extreme. This is the red extreme poverty. This fortunately was reduced a bit, but again, not dramatically. So it's not. It's a story of challenge and of the need to have better policies in the future rather than of success, obviously. Even though 7.4% of extreme poverty is now something where you can imagine something closer to 1%, it's still 9 million people in a country of the size of Mexico. But this is not the interesting part. This is really, what's interesting is what's behind that. And here are the dimensions. This is education, which is basically access to basic education, and for people, for young students who are in education, and then for older people, the level which they should have by law when they were in education, by the standards, the thresholds in place when they were in education. This has been declining as universal education has been achieved. Now, really, the interesting thing is not access to basic education, but access to the next level, post-basic education, higher education, which is really where a lot of the inequality is generated, income inequality, and also access to effective access, access to sufficiently quality services. As you can see, one dimension where there has been a lot of progress is health. There was a very important program expanding health coverage, which is the Seguro Popular program, and the associated expansions of infrastructure. And again, there is very important to see if that is actually effective access, or if they just have a card which says you can go to services when you're in. So, but that explains a lot of the progress. Access to social security, this is a big challenge. As you can see, 71 million people, almost 72, still don't have access to Social Security in Mexico, which is basically you have access to Social Security if you have access to a contributive system like IMSS in Mexico. It's called esta. They are for private sector or for government sector employees. And also, we count as access, even though it's very different in terms of benefits, if you have a basic non-contributive pension from a program which is called Adultos Mayores, or from other programs, which is just that, just a pension, and a much smaller pension than you would get with contributive programs. But even with that, we still face a big challenge. That's one of the challenges in Mexico. And a second very important challenge, let me see if I have it here, is income. Now, income poverty has been extremely stable in Mexico, not only over the last decades, but I think very similar to the US, over a very much longer period, because salaries for low-income workers have been very stagnant. So there are many issues which obviously go beyond social policy, which have to do with low growth, but not only low growth. Mexico has grown modestly, but it has grown, and in a long period, like the last 30 or 40 years, certainly the cumulative growth has been important. But that growth has actually not benefited, at least according to the statistics that we have, labor income for the poor. So we have a big challenge in the income side. This is housing. This is services in housing. Access to food. We use this is not a nutritious survey based on anthropometric measures. It's a survey where we ask people, did you feel you couldn't get food in the last, sufficient food for your kids in the last X period, no? And this is the population below the extreme poverty, income poverty line. So this is the income poor. And there you can see basically no progress, no? 17% in 2008, almost 70% in last year, below the food poverty line, okay? So this is a big challenge for Mexico, and obviously, and this is below the income poverty line. Then you can see the distribution of the population by the categories we saw in the graph. No, these are the people who are in moderate poverty, in extreme poverty, and these above are the people who are neither poor nor vulnerable. No, this is a good news number. No. Well, you cannot see this, but if you go to CONEVAL's page, you will see, to our reports of poverty of this year, you will see a very detailed table. Then if you go to the annexes, to the statistical annexes, you will see all these disaggregated by groups, rural, indigenous populations, children, different age groups, and all the dimensions, and all the subdimensions. No? For example, in the case of housing, it's based on whether you have you don't have a dirt floor, but you have a solid floor, the quality of the walls, the ceiling, and how many people per room you have. And those are weighted. Those are, if you have at least one of those lacking, then you are deprived. So you can check the more detailed methodology there. One very useful thing about this is actually the territorial disaggregation. And you see, this is the map of Mexico, and as you can see, it's very, very, very clear. The distribution of poverty. There's a south, north, and south, center, north division, which is very clear. No? Extreme poverty is concentrated in the southern states, which are Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Guerrero, and then it gradually disappears, and certainly the least poor states are at the center and the north of the country. Okay, and then you can see that at the municipality level, there it becomes a bit more complex and interesting, you can see that it's not just a south-north question. It's really a mountain versus an indigenous populations. These red dots correlate a lot with the distribution of indigenous populations and the height. These are mountains. This is the Sierra Madre in Mexico, and basically what reflects is lack of access to economic opportunities, and even very often to public services, because there are very isolated communities, linguistically, very often, and also for much more complex reasons, from the economy and from the policy, from public policies. Here you have the same for extreme poverty. Here you have changes, no? You can see between 2010 and 2015, which are the last 2 years we had a census or census-like instrument. And we can identify the poorest municipalities in two senses. One is the highest poverty rates, which are generally these municipalities which are very isolated, but also, very importantly, the highest poverty absolute numbers, which are completely different, no? Some are here very, very near Mexico City, in Ecatepec, for example, or in Acapulco, where we were last time with Sabina in the network. Those are not poor by incidence, the areas, but because there are so many people, a 5% extreme poverty rate represents a lot of poor people. Okay, so that's very important to keep in mind for policy. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have this new instrument which allows us to see poverty at a very fine level, which should be extremely useful for public policymakers at the local, national, and federal level, who want to actually go directly to the poorest neighborhoods, households even. No? Okay? This again is based on this indirect estimation, so it has always to be checked. We've done checks, no? We've actually tried to go to these areas and see whether things are actually as they look in these smaller methodologies. And then finally, you can do something extremely useful, which is see the contrast between different populations. And let me jump, there's clearly one of the things which is very obvious from these measures is that the poorest group by far is indigenous populations. Now, if you just go to indigenous populations and ignore all other targeting criteria, you have a very effective extreme poverty targeting method, which is very unfortunate, no? That it's like that. And to see this in the let me see. Yes, if you combine it, for example, no, extreme poverty among women in rural indigenous communities is 45.7% extreme poverty, while in men in urban areas, non-indigenous populations, is less than 4%. So a 10-fold gap between these two groups. In the same country, no walls, no internal walls, no passports, no tariffs, free movement, and still you have these extreme inequalities. So the message of these measures are extremely clear. No? You have to reach these populations and make sure that you have to see what is failing in these populations, social security. Unfortunately, everything is failing at the same time. Okay, and that's the richness of these measures, which allows you to see that very tragic result of history, poverty, etc. No, well, let me finish with the what's next. No, certainly for Mexico, but I think this reflects will reflect for many countries. Mexico has the advantage that we started early in this. No, so we are thinking about these things perhaps earlier than other countries who started later. And one is to think about how do you update these measures. These measures are based, I'm sure in most countries, not in the personal ethics of the researchers, but in the normative background of the countries, no? By elected officials, which is representative of law, no? Of what countries consider legally to be their aim, organized in legal democratic societies. No? And that changes, obviously. No? Countries become more ambitious over time, and you want to incorporate those changes. No? And that's what we have just done. We will start, the next 10 years will be based on higher thresholds. For example, now we are going to, and also some new dimensions. And now by law, Congress said, look, we have to integrate roads, access to roads, and we did, we completed a very, very sophisticated measure of access to roads, which we'll start to use to incorporate in the measure in this next 10 years. Higher education, again, was introduced. Consumption patterns changed in 10 years a lot. So we have updated the food basket and the non-food basket. Even the inflation, the basket which is used for inflation has changed. So we have to take all that into consideration. And then eventually one has to consider whether you want a richer measure, no? Something which is really more useful for policy making than the very bare minimum, no? And there you have a trade-off, no, between the richest possible, most interesting measure and what you can actually measure with the data you have. And measure in a way which is replicable in time, no? Where you can actually do it year after year and see the evolution of that with a single basis, and in a way which is not only replicable by us, but by anybody. So you can actually publish the stata file, the do files for everybody to do it, okay? Between that and having something which is much more useful, which is really, what is the problem within education? Is the quality bad? Are the teachers bad? Is it insufficient days of schooling? Is it the roads which lead to schools which are not good enough? What's the problem? No? And for that, we are going to create a complementary system. This is not to take out the emphasis on poverty. That's extremely important because it goes to we still, as you saw, have a big challenge in terms of poverty, but to go beyond that and look at effective access to social rights and new dimensions which we don't consider, always based on the social rights which are in the Constitution. So we are not trying to invent, we're not doing moral philosophy. Maybe we should, but we're not. We're doing legal analysis of the normative framework of our Constitution and using that to enrich the poverty measure. Well, I will leave it at that. And if you have any questions or criticisms or whatever, please. I think Mexico, as I said, is an interesting case study because of the time, because it was early. It was, again, we had to innovate a lot, for good or bad. We have to improvise. We couldn't take something from the shelf, as you luckily can now. No, obviously you will have you take the basics, and then you will have to do the same that we did. You will have to adapt this to your political, normative, social context and economic context. But I think it's a nice case study. So, if any, and there's a lot of information about it. You can consult it in CONEVAL's webpage. We have a lot of that in English, as well as in Spanish. But if you have any specific questions, please. I don't know if we have time for questions or what's the agenda now. How are we in terms of time? So no question. No, do you have any question? Quickly, yeah?
Thank you for this very interesting insight. Thank you for this very interesting insight. I would have a question about the 6 dimensions, because if I remember correctly, you have 2 dimensions related to housing, right? One housing services and one housing quality.
Exactly.
Could you just briefly explain what's the difference between these and why you chose to separate?
Sure. The difference is that the housing quality is the building, no? Whether the level of, how do you say, asignación, crowding, whether there's crowding, and the quality of the materials, no? The most important, whether the dirt versus non-dirt floor, no? It's a challenge because Mexico is very diverse in climates. So what's the right quality in the coast in Mexico City? Very different, but and that's again another topic for the future. And the second is where you have the services part, electricity, water, drainage, how those things work, whether you have access to those basic services. Well, if we don't have more questions, I'll... Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scott. Thank you very much, Dr. Cruz. And I guess with that, the summer school is officially open. So I guess that before breaking out to tea, I think we just want to informally start getting to know each other. So I guess that, yeah, is that okay? So I guess we're going to do a very quick round of introductions, but very, very brief introductions by everybody here. So you see that we are a number of us. So just who you are and where you come from, I think it's a good way to break the ice and start getting to know each other. So, Chris, can you help me perhaps with the mic?
All right, well,
Okay.
Okay, so while Sabina says her goodbyes, we will start the session. We have roughly about 25 minutes to go before we break out for tea. Now, it's essential to keep it time, simply because if there's a delay in going out for the tea, then there'll be a delay in the lecture sessions, and that would affect the lunch hour and later in the evening. We don't want to finish late in the evening because we acknowledge that everyone is exhausted, and so we want to keep up with time. So we roughly hope that each of you take about half a minute to sort of introduce yourself, to say what is your name, where you're from, and quickly what you do. So please let me start the session by introducing myself. So I'm Musha. I work at Ophi, home is Malaysia, and I work on the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index at Ophi. So would you like to start? Yes, sure.
Hello everyone, my name is Carolina, I'm Mexican and I'm a research assistant at El Colegio de México.
Hello everyone, my name is Guru Vasis, I'm from India. I'm doing PhD, my working area is multidimensional poverty. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Dario Galindo, I work in Fondo para la Paz. We work in poverty regions with mostly